Greetings from Serbia. Welcome to the NT podcast, Science and Theology podcast, the best in Balkan in this field. Today we have a special guest from Norway, Dr. Sigve Tonstad, professor of New Testament and scholar. Dr. Tonstad, welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We will be discussing today prophecies, authorship of Revelation and John's Gospel, the fate of the weekend, and many other fascinating topics. If you enjoy this content, dear audience, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Let's dive right in. My first question is a comment from one Old Testament scholar. He says, there is nothing in the Bible that is an actual prophecy about anything that's going to happen in the future. So, Dr. Tonstad, is this comment true? And are there any examples from the New Testament that there are actual prophecies and not ex eventu? What do you think?
Well, I wish. So, who is your Old Testament scholar to say that? That is a pretty radical view. But I suppose you could say, well, what does he mean by prophecy? Because most of the sayings in the Old Testament, most of them had some kind of application to the immediate situation. So to say that that there is nothing in the Old Testament that that applies to the future, that I think is way too strong. But I will acknowledge that many things where we think that it only applied to the future may actually have applied to the time of the writer or the person in the Old Testament times. Now, I am a New Testament person, and the New Testament thinks that the Old Testament people, like Peter says, oh, those people, they spoke about things and they didn't know, they didn't really even understand it themselves in their own time, because there was, a future orientation to it. And so, yes, you can have predictions, prophecy in the Old Testament, I think, and you can have use of the Old Testament in the New, where the New Testament will hear a text in the Old Testament that isn't necessarily intentionally prophetic, but the New Testament author will use it and apply it to its own message, and Jesus does that all the time. And of course, you have the Gospel of Matthew, where it says over and over, as it was written, and this was to fulfill the prophecy of this and that. So as a New Testament scholar, there is no way I can agree with an Old Testament scholar who says that there is nothing, no sort of future orientation in the Old Testament.
Amazing, but can you give an example that in New Testament we have something that is written, and after decades or centuries after that is written, we have fulfillment? Can you give an example anywhere?
Well, you have Jesus refers to Daniel, the prophet, and says when you see these things happening in the speech that Jesus gave in the Mount of Olives in Matthew 24, then you should study the prophet Daniel, because he's the abomination of desolation, and so the question there is really, is this something that is imminent in the time of Jesus? It is. The text of origin is in the book of Daniel. Jesus refers to it in his own time. Does he is he suggesting that this is something that is imminent, happening in his time, or is it still future, something that is going to be fulfilled later? And those questions you can have, but then there are so many texts. Matthew is especially fond of these Old Testament, where he says, "Oh, this was to fulfill this. This was to fulfill that," and sometimes in the Gospel of John it is more implicit, where things that are said about God in the Old Testament are applied to Jesus in the New Testament. So there is a kind of taking possession of Old Testament passages in the New Testament. So maybe I could say that when I read the Gospel of Luke, the first two chapters in the Gospel of Luke, especially the first two chapters in Greek, the Greek of those chapters is archaic. It is like if I were to start talking to you in English now and say thee and thou and so on, King James English, 17th century English, then you would say, why are you doing that? You are speaking to me in an archaic language. But Luke seems to write Greek in an archaic style that resembles the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. And the beauty of that is that he doesn't think that there is an Old Testament and a New Testament. He thinks that there is the First Testament and the Second Testament. There is actually one story. There is no suture line between the old and the new. It's so Luke writes, and he plans to get it published. He's going to publish his gospel. And where will he publish it? He's going to publish it in the Bible to make, to just expand on what is already scripture, you might say. So there is we have to think about it more as first and second and not old and new.
Good point. But let's be honest, Dr. Tonstad, because when we read story about Emmanuel in Isaiah, that's not Jesus in that context. That's 8th century Assyria and other stuff. Also in Micah, that someone will be born from Bethlehem. I think that's not in original context about Jesus. But New Testament authors say, hey, yeah, that's prophecy. So what do you think?
No, I agree with you that they are not at that time that they are intentionally prophetic. That there is something happening in at the time of the author, but there is this notion of surplus of meaning. That there is an excess. There is more in those texts than you can apply to the immediate situation, and of course that is very, very essential for the New Testament to think that the Old Testament came, that there was a surplus, as it were, that wasn't all exhausted in its own time. So one of my mentors who passed away in January, there is actually a memorial service for him in America today in Durham in North Carolina. Richard Hayes, he has written books, Echoes of Scripture in the Letters of Paul, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, and he was the foremost expert on how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, and also how you can ground Christological readings in the Old Testament. So if people want to explore the topic that you are bringing up, I would recommend very much the work of Richard Hayes in America and Richard Bauckham in the United Kingdom, because both of them have made that their maybe their most important contribution.